And I want to take this opportunity to speak from my own perspective of research and activism on the troubled relationship between Islam and feminism. By now you have all heard the word Islamic feminism, which started to have currency in early 1990s. And it is referred to a type of feminism that locates in its legitimacy inside Islam's sacred texts, but at the same time argues for equality for women on all fronts. There is now a wide discussion on this, and I have contributed to that discussion. And my position is that the composite term Islamic feminism is actually too wide. Because who is Islam and what is Islam? And who's feminism and what's feminism? And these are the kind of conversation that has not been taking place much. And what I want to do here, I have two goals. One is to show how the struggle for equality and justice in Muslim context is embedded in a dialectic of religious authority and power. And this dialectic must be understood and addressed if we want to have any meaningful change and reform. In other words, this struggle for equality and justice is at once theological and political. And it is so difficult to say when theology ends and politics begin. And the second point that my aim here is to give an idea of the work of the new reformist and feminist scholarship and activism who are arguing for equality and justice from within an Islamic framework, and how they are changing the terms of the debate within Islamic discourses. And at the same time, how they are paving the way for a meaningful conversation between Muslim and non-Muslim ways of living and seeing the world. And we do need that conversation. I'm aware that I have only 20 minutes, so I will give you the gist of my argument and then try to flesh it out as possible as the time allows me. At the heart of the Muslim debate over religion, law, and gender, there is a political and ideological struggle. And this ideological struggle actually relates to the nature of Islam and how to relate to its sacred text. Secondly, my second argument is, if we can have the PowerPoint and the first slide. My second argument is that the idea of gender equality has created an epistemological crisis in Muslim legal tradition. So what I mean by epistemological crisis is here. I take this idea and concept from philosopher McIntyre. And he argues that every rational inquiry is embedded in a tradition of learning. That definitely applies to Islamic jurisprudence, whatever we call Islamic sciences. And that traditional learning reaches a point of crisis when the arguments no longer can be addressed rationally from within. And I feel this is exactly where we are. So what happens, the idea of gender equality is an alien idea, has never existed in Muslim legal tradition, as it did not exist in other pre-modern legal traditions. And now this idea, along with human rights, is actually like an earthquake in that tradition. So it is changing everything, and the tradition is trying to struggle with that. And the third element of my argument is that the breakthrough came in the late 20th century with the rise of new reformist and feminist voices and scholarship. And I also emphasize activism because I think scholarship on its own is not enough. It is extremely important, but it needs to be linked with activism. So to give you, and can we go to the second next slide? To give you an idea of the nature of this kind of crisis, I have these two quotes from Ibn Qayyim, the famous 14th century. The first quote, as you will see, is about Sharia, and we all agree on that. The essence of Sharia is justice. The second quote is actually reflects the position of fiqh on marriage. And marriage law is so important to the conception of gender rights. It treats women like a slave. And basically these two quotes are from the same book. And this is what I call crisis, because it faces Muslims with a moral dilemma. Part of their tradition speaks to them, another part of the tradition no longer speaks to them. And I think it is important to acknowledge this crisis, because without this acknowledgement, it would be difficult to find a way out of it. And the fact is that the idea of gender equality, as I said, is new. It did not exist in any other legal tradition until 20th century. In fact, we can say that Muslim legal tradition, though it was patriarchal like other traditions, but gave women a much better set of rights than other legal traditions. For instance, that was until 19th, early 20th century. So in England, it was not until 1882, with the passage of Married Women's Property Act, that women acquired property rights. This right Muslim women had at the same time, all the time. So my question is that what happened? Why the Muslim tradition, legal tradition, started to lag behind after 19th century? And the answer for this, we need to look for the two sets of related, place it in two sets of the context. The first one is the Muslim encounter with modernity, which started from late 17th, 18th century. And this encounter was a painful and humiliating encounter for Muslims. It came at the back of Western colonialism. And also it was at the time that Muslims' civilization was beyond its zenith. And as a result, what happened was that Muslims became defensive. And the tradition became so important to them. And another thing that complicated the situation was that this encounter with modernity and the way that this encounter was done made the whole issue of Muslim women a really emotional issue, but at the same time, it made women cultures, symbols of cultural authenticity. And this can happen in other religious traditions, but the extent that it has happened in Muslim context is really unprecedented. And the second context that I would like to look at it, and I think I will focus on that, is the 20th century transformations in relations between the shifts, both globally and locally, between politics of religion, law, and gender. And the fact is that the Muslim practices changed with the relationship between law and the custodians of the law that were jurists changed with the state as well. If we can go to the next slide. So what we see is that the first part of the 20th century, with the rise of Muslim nation states, we see a retreat of religion from politics. And if we look at the trend, we see in the first part of the 20th century, the trend is towards secularization of laws and legal systems. But fiqh conceptions of family are kept intact. All Muslim countries, apart from Saudi Arabia, put aside the fiqh concepts in the area of law. And other countries can only keep the family law. And that really gave family law, made it the last bastion of Islamic legal tradition. And the exception here is Turkey. In 1926, Turkey adopted the Swiss law, which at that time was not much better than fiqh. But the situation changes after that. And in the second part of the 20th century. And what changes the situation is the rise of political Islam. And the rise of political Islam in 1960s and 1970s. And the zenith of it is Iranian Revolution in 1979. And in 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution. We have Islam as an ideology for change, as a political ideology with lots of promises. But the slogan of the political Islam is return to Sharia. But in fact, in practice, is return to fiqh, is return to the pre-modern interpretations of the Sharia. And 1979 is important on many accounts. It's not only the Iranian Revolution, it is also the Women's Convention, the CEDAW, the Conventions Against All Forms of Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. And this convention puts women's right and gender equality at the front of human rights. It was there before that, but CEDAW gave it a different international mandate. So in 1980s, we see the clash between two frames of reference. One is political Islam, with the slogan of return to Sharia, which is in fact return to the fiqh. The other one is the human rights and feminism and CEDAW. And these two frameworks clash. And their clash by early 1990s produces a new discourse. And this new discourse is what becomes known as Islamic feminism. And in fact, I want to suggest that political Islam had some unintended consequences. One of them was giving birth to Islamic feminism. And I always say that it is the unwanted child of political Islam. But it is quite a legitimate child of Islam, because at the heart of it, gender equality is so much part of Islam. So it is not, we were reaching to that too late, but that doesn't mean that the idea of gender equality is not part of the Islamic tradition. And what political Islam did was bringing fiqh text out of the closet and opening it to a public debate. And that was exactly because of their policies. And the policies were really, if you look at political Islam, it is focused on women. It is changing the family law, bringing the Zina laws back. You know, in 1979, it's not only Iranian Revolution. We have the revival of Zina laws in Pakistan. We have abandoning or dismantling of the reforms in Egypt, in all places. And as a result, there is a new response by Muslim reformists, thinkers, to the political Islam. And what makes this reformist thinking, in my view, important and separate from, different from the earlier trend of reform is that when we look at, of course, the idea of reform has always been part of the tradition. But when we look at the early 20th century, the idea of reform was basically geared as finding the genealogy of new concepts like democracy, like women's rights in Islam's sacred texts. You know, that is why Shura became such an important concept. But what the new trend of Muslim reform thought is doing is putting the focus on construction of knowledge from within Islam. How rights are understood, how the Quran is understood, how these ideas are constructed. So simultaneously, concurrently, we have the rise of new thinkers. Alongside with them, we have the rise of feminist thinkers as well, and feminist activism. And it is not surprising because, political Islam comes into power in late 20th century with the promise of bringing justice, but it fails. And then we have women out in the public space. We have women educated. So many of them go back to the Quran sacred text. And they break the link between patriarchy and Islam. And that creates a new consciousness. This is happening, this has been happening all over the world. And another point that I want to say, but very quickly, is that there is another turning point, and that turning point is 9/11. What happened after 2009? In the aftermath of 2009 and the war of terror, many Muslims, rightly or wrongly, saw it as an attack on Islam. And also the policies, the way that the war on terror was conducted, the illegal invasion of Afghanistan and after that Iraq, actually to many was a new colonialist project. So many people, many women, many activists and scholars were caught in between. And another thing that happened is that the fact is that the human rights and feminism also started losing their moral ground, the same way that political Islam started to lose its moral ground. Because political Islam came with the promise of justice. It failed badly. And feminism and human rights with the promise of justice, and that failed as well. So what we have is a kind of new realism. And I think this new realism is important because it can start a new conversation. So what I want to do now is to summarize. And what we have now is, broadly speaking, I can say we have two positions, two opposed positions. One is advocates of a legalistic, absolutist, and patriarchal understanding of Islam. And they don't, which is premised on the notion of duty and has little room for modern conceptions. The other is advocates of pluralistic, tolerant, and feminist understanding premised on the notion of rights, and it as advocated by modern discourses. The struggle over Islam's sacred texts has always been there, and it will continue. But what is new is that now women are actually, the question of gender equality is not only at the heart of it, but women are key participants in this struggle and debate and shaping it. And women were key participants at the beginning of Islam, but by the time that fiqh emerged, their voices were silenced. And I want to conclude this with a question, which I hope can open a debate. Can a feminist discourse that takes its legitimacy from Islam's sacred text and has to operate within a closed legal system like fiqh, with little support from the power base of that tradition, i.e. the Muslim ulama, bring transformation from within? In other words, can its advocate nurture a gender discourse that meets women's aspiration for equality? And this has been a question that I personally have been struggling with for at least 2 decades. And my answer to this question is a qualified yes, for 3 reasons. First, there is a theoretical concord between the egalitarian spirit of Islam and the feminist quest for justice and a just world. And it is so important not to reduce feminism to women's rights, because without justice in the world, there can be no justice for women. And to me, one aspect of feminism is affirmation of the full humanity of women. And this affirmation is obviously there in the Quran, but not in Muslim legal tradition, and not in fiqh, The second reason that I have is that legal traditions and theories must be understood in the cultural, political, and social context in which they exist and operate. The very idea of gender equality belongs to the modern world and only became inherent to conceptions of justice along with the expansion of human rights discourses in the course of 20th century. We must not forget that most of the time legal theory is reactive. Changes happen on the ground, then legal theory catches up. That is definitely the case with the Western legal theory on position of women and many other issues. And fiqh is also a legal theory. It has the capacity, and it has survived so far, and I hope it will survive, and so needs to catch up. And now the challenge that it faces is the challenge of equality and women's rights. And in some ways, the genie is out of the bottle. Political Islam brought fiqh text into a public space. Finally, by opening the way for a meaningful and constructive conversation between feminism and Muslim legal tradition, the emerging feminist voices in Islam have the potential to overcome the dichotomy between Islam and feminism, which has been a feature of politics of gender among Muslims in modern times. This conversation has both epistemological and political implications. On the epistemological side of it, feminist critical theory enables us to see how unreflective assumptions and common sense arguments limit and deform of knowledge and give us tools for analyzing relations between the production of knowledge and the practices of power. It also provides us with a methodology to include women's voices in lawmaking, in production of knowledge. On the political front, bringing current Muslim legal tradition into conversation with feminism can pave the way for, as I said, the transcending all this ideology between Islam and feminism, between Islam and human rights. And to me, this dichotomy actually so far has served a very important role, and that is masking, covering the real side of power and struggle. And this real side of struggle is between patriarchy on the one hand and despotism and authoritarianism on the other hand. They always come together, whether in the secular guise or whether in Islamic guise. And we need actually to uncover this side. And we need to understand where is the main side of struggle. So unmasking this reality entails, to me, two linked processes. One is recovering and reclaiming the ethical and egalitarian ethos of Islam's sacred texts. And that is what feminist Muslims are doing. They are recovering. They are going back to the tradition, the voices that were silenced. They are recovering those voices and also reclaiming the ethical and egalitarian message of the Quran. And also, what they are doing, they are exposing the relations between the production of knowledge and practices of power. What we need in Muslim context is democratization of the production of religious knowledge. And that democratization is absolutely necessary. And it is only then that we can aspire to real and meaningful change that can dent the deeply embedded assumptions and tendencies that have shaped our religious and cultural and political realities. Thank you.